Hello everybody, I'm KC, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About. Today, let's talk about the Gravity Falls episode, A Tale of Two Stands. Oh please, I imagine you saying because I can't hear you. Tale of Two Stands is so 10 weeks ago. Don't you know the thing now is speculating the insane things that will happen in Dipper and Mabel versus the future? Well, yes, and trust me, we will get to that episode when it comes out. But since that's not until next week, I thought I'd take some time to talk about arguably the biggest episode of Gravity Falls thus far. Now, most of you may not know this, but Let's Talk About has actually been going on since last October as written reviews on my Tumblr. I did a 2-part written review on this episode shortly after it came out. Most of my points in this video will be taken from that and slightly revised. So if you did manage to read it, I apologize for repeating myself. But not a lot of people did read it, so let's actually talk about the episode here. So after the big reveal of the author of the journals being Stan's brother, fans were speculating on what the first thing he would do would be. After Stan warmly greets his brother, he punches Stan in the face. Well, a few people got it right, so congrats. Since the agents are right outside, they can't leave the basement, so this is where Stanley finally explains what has been going on. That's right, Grunkle Stan's name is actually Stanley. Turns out he took the identity of his brother Stanford after he disappeared. Again, congrats to those who figured this out. Now, this may be the most tightly written episode in the series, so we have a lot to go over. Before we get to the brothers themselves, let's talk about some other things. All of the callbacks are wonderful. Seeing Stanford fill in the pages of the journal for the first time made me almost as excited as Dipper. Also, why is it so funny and eye-opening to meet parental figures in the show? First we had Robbie's parents, and now we see more of Stan's. The idea of his father running a pawn shop and his mother being a phone psychic is hysterical. Can you honestly tell me that doesn't make perfect sense? There were a lot of great callbacks and references before and after we get to Gravity Falls. If you want to see which ones I enjoyed the most, you can check out my reaction video. I also wanted to talk about the great voice acting for Stan and Ford. When I first heard that J.K. Simmons was going to be playing the author, I was cautiously optimistic. Don't get me wrong, I love J.K. Simmons, and I have nothing but respect for the man, but I was having trouble visualizing it. I just kept thinking, I hope this turns out well. Luckily, once he spoke as Stanford, all of those worries disappeared. He does a wonderful job here, and even changes his voice a bit as a younger Stanford to make it more believable. He does a great job of portraying this character we've been wanting to meet for 3 years, from his adolescence to his descent into paranoia to a distinguished old man. Now for other Grunkle. Something I've wanted to bring up for a while is that Stanley has had a big advantage being played by the show's creator. Up until this episode, Alex Hirsch was the only one who truly knew Stan's struggles and goals, and is able to convey that to the audience without us even realizing it. This applies more to episodes like Gideon Rises and Not What He Seems than here, but it still stands. Watching past episodes with this story in mind, there are some times where you can hear desperation in Stan's voice that may have been intentional. Hirsch has always been funny as Stan, and here is no exception. Those failed businesses Stan has are some of the funniest moments in the episode, but he also does a great job of delivering on the dramatic moments. What were those dramatic moments exactly? Well, let's dig a bit deeper into Stan's backstory. Let's get this out of the way. Yes, Stan's design as a teenager is inconsistent with what we saw in Dreamscapers. It honestly didn't bother me as much as it seemed to bother everyone else. It did bother me about as much as Robbie's young, conflicting character designs. Actually, Robbie's may have been a bit more annoying since those conflicting episodes were back-to-back. But regardless, and I'm not even counting Boys Crazy. Even though I used that design in my 30 years ago comics, it always seemed like a bit of a stretch to me. Stan did look kind of like that in his teens, just less chiseled. So I appreciate that they kept the design we've all gotten used to, just made it a bit more realistic. Now back to Stan's story. Stan has been one of the biggest mysteries in the show since pretty much the beginning. And as the show went on, he became even more shady and mysterious. The fandom speculated wildly on what exactly Stan's deal was. Here we pretty much get the whole story. A story that, in my opinion, is very satisfying. Much like with McGucket, this new information on Stan shines a whole new light on the character. The fact that he was kicked out of his house as a teenager and is told he's not welcome back until he can make a fortune explains Stan's tendencies to be cheap very well. He does try to make it big the quick way, but those ventures quickly fail because, let's face it, unless he's selling to the single-minded people of Gravity Falls, Stan is not a good salesman. He's also kicked out because of a huge misunderstanding, which we'll get to in a minute, and is left out in the cold with no one to turn to, which is why, despite coming off as kind of an asshole, he cares so much about Dipper and Mabel, and has formed such an attachment to them. In the end, Stan was just a guy who got a rough break in life. He tried so hard to gain success so maybe his life would go back to the way it was. Even though Stanford pretty much turns his back on him when their father kicks him out, he still comes when he calls for help many years later. Despite what he did, that care for his brother never really went away. When he sees what bad shape his brother is in, he wants to help him. He wants to be there for him. So when Ford wants Stanley to take his journal and get as far away from him as possible, just when there's a slight glimmer of hope that he may be able to do what he's always dreamed of doing with his brother, he kind of snaps, leading to the fight that would cause Stanford to get sucked into the portal he invented. But despite all of this episode shows that Stan's first priority has always been his family. Everything he went through to get his brother back is proof of that. Stan sacrificed any future he may have had as Stanley Pines to bring Ford back, and in the end, he's not rewarded for it. Yes, he rescued Stanford, but Stanford doesn't thank him. In fact, he seems really angry. Why is that? Well, let's take a minute to talk about Stanford. While this episode pretty much tells us Stan's entire story, Ford remained a bit more of a mystery, but that makes sense. This was Ford's introductory episode. He's a brand new character, and we needed a bit more time to get to know him before we dug deep into his secrets as the author. Not that this episode doesn't explain anything, in fact it goes into quite a bit. Why he wrote the journals in the first place, how he met McGucket, even the event that caused McGucket to quit the project and began Ford's descent into paranoia. What happened in the presumably months between the portal test and when Stanley arrives in Gravity Falls is still unclear, but this episode was more focused on the relationship between the original Pines twins and why it's so strained. I really did like Ford as a character though, despite some of the choices he makes here. I like the fact that he has 6 fingers plays into who he is and where he goes. It's why he went to study anomalies in Gravity Falls in the first place, and he's bullied for it, which is why Stanley stands up for him so much. Ford, at least when they were kids, was just as supportive to Stan as Stan is to Ford. There's a scene where you see Stan copying off Ford's test in class, and he just lets him. It was the best way Ford could help Stan the way Stan helps him. Now, with this episode, to talk about Ford, we have to talk about the brothers' relationship itself. So let's finally talk about the scene that caused the rift between the twins. So, in the situation that cost Stanford his dream school and Stanley his home, who was in the wrong? To me, both of them. I definitely appreciate that the episode didn't have Stanley sabotaging his brother's project, but instead he accidentally breaks it and tries to fix it. Now, Ford made a huge assumption based on minimal evidence, and that is where he is in the wrong. But what does Stanley say when he's being accused? Yes, he says it was an accident, but he also immediately suggests that since Ford didn't get into the school, now they can go treasure hunting. That's like saying, yeah, I know your dreams are crushed, but that's okay, now we can do my thing. Now, does this mean Ford is justified in not speaking up when their father kicks Stanley out? Of course not. But this is right after Stanley had done the worst thing he had ever done to his brother, which at this point in time was probably not a very long list. He's still hurt, and he's letting that cloud his judgment, which is what Stanley will do years later, but we'll get to that in a second. First, let me say this. If you are very one-sided on the conflicts in this episode, saying that either Stan is right or Ford is right, you do not have a sibling. Either that or you have the most perfect sibling relationship ever. If you do, that's great, more power to you. But I have a sister, and we are about as polar opposite as Stan and Ford. So while this episode shows Stan as a victim because, well, he is, I can't really hate Ford. No, I've never gotten in an argument this huge with my sister, but this situation is still identifiable. I've made snap judgments like that, a lot of us have, and I was about Ford's age in this scene when I started getting better at it. And I do think if Ford had known what Stan was going through, and he wasn't so wrapped up in his research, he would have offered to help him. But instead, that one fight caused a rift that neither is willing to mend, until Ford finally reaches out to the only person he can trust, in his darkest hour. The other confrontation between the brothers comes presumably a few months after the test run of the portal, and Ford's not doing great. Not only is this portrayed well in just about a minute of screen time, but we know just how badly Ford was doing at this time from the journals. He wasn't sleeping, he always felt like he was being watched, and he wasn't sure who he could trust. So the fact that he called Stanley to help says a lot about how he feels about his brother. When Stan reaches out and asks to talk things through, Ford goes through quite a few emotions in just those couple seconds. You can tell he's not in his right mind, that he's lost and doesn't know what to do. While it's not entirely clear what he's going through in this episode, it makes a bit more sense as the show goes on. Something I did find interesting though, the more I thought about it, The fight the brothers have here is a mirrored version of the fight that got Stanley kicked out of his house. Think about it. Before, Stanford wasn't listening to Stanley's side of the story, and when Stanley did get to talk, he wasn't explaining what happened well. Here, Stan is still angry at the idea that when he finally may get his brother back, he's asked to get as far away from him as possible, while Ford isn't explaining just how dangerous the things he's up against are. In every fight in this episode, they both made mistakes. Some had bigger consequences than others, but neither is without fault here. While I can't justify what Ford said to Stan at the end of the episode, or why he didn't thank him, it's tough for me to be angry at him. No scene shows why better than this one, where the two of them are fighting in the lab and Stanley gets burned, leaving that mark most of us thought was a tattoo. Stanford immediately stops fighting, apologizes, and asks if he's okay. Not only does this gesture show that he still cares about his brother, but I noticed something here. This is the only time in the whole episode either brother said, "I'm sorry." Both of them have hurt the other greatly, and that burn was the only thing that got an apology. I think once one of them says that, then maybe the rift between them will finally close. But for now, what we have is two stubborn old men hiding their feelings from each other. Hopefully this reconciliation will come soon. We just want these sad grunkles to be happy. Overall, this episode was fantastic! Mostly for the fact that it worked as well as it did. Most shows that have an ongoing mystery tend to disappoint the majority of fans once the answers are revealed. And while I do know some people who weren't satisfied with the answers we got, the majority of people, including myself, were very happy with this. I mean, think about it. This kind of boils down to Stan stealing the identity of his long-lost twin brother. That sounds like something from a soap opera, and could have easily gone downhill. But it works! These two are very believable characters in their strengths and weaknesses, and that's what makes this episode so strong. These are the most answers we have ever gotten in an episode, and while I am a bit sad that some headcanons are now debunked, what we have here is a wonderful and heartbreaking story that hopefully leads to a happy ending for these two. But to bring this back to current topics, it looks like the GF team aren't quite done breaking our hearts. Dipper and Mabel vs. the Future looks like a big episode that will build on things this episode was foreshadowing. So let's hope the team can deliver again. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Please go easy on us, guys.